Night was a hard blue over the wall, a color made of empty breath and moonlight, of iron skies polished thin by wind. The braziers along the rampart burned low, their coals not so much warming as throwing a stubborn orange upon the snow that had come and come again until it lay like an old king's beard down the face of the world. Melisandre stood before one of those braziers with her gloved hands bared to it, not for heat but for sight. Heat was nothing. The fire existed to speak. In the heart of the burning, she watched shapes gather and fall away. A stag raised its rack and turned to ash that ran like rain down a ship's prow. A crown of swords bent toward a face she could not see, and then the swords softened, flowed together, became a single length of light that had no flame, and yet was made of it. Snow flocked the vision, not flakes but the idea of them, and within that storm a white beast prowled with eyes like fresh wounds. The beast lifted its head, and the fire found a boy with a man's mouth, and the habit of listening rather than silence. A boy whose very name was a prayer disguised as a jest. Lord Snow, the wall called him, and the fire did not deny it. Azor Ahai. She said into the steam of her breath, and the smoke shifted as if a fish had turned in a deep lake. The old words came as easily as the heat leaving her skin. The prince that was promised, born amidst salt and smoke, under a bleeding star. But prophecy was a road lined with mirrors, and names could be knives. She had thought once to pin it to a king of cold iron and unyielding will, to make all the faces agree and call that clarity. Now here was the flame arguing with her in the gentle way the truly sure had, not contradicting but showing. It showed the boy, and the wolf that was not his shadow but his answer, and it showed a wall not made of ice but of bones that did not lie down. Snow whispered across the stone. She closed her hands, savored the sting, and stepped back from the brazier. Behind her, the night wind carried the layered noises of Castle Black. The muted clang of a hammer in the forge, the cough of a sentry, the short bark of laughter from men who had survival for humor. Beneath those, the deeper voice of the wall itself, groaning like a ship under rough weather. It was a sound she had never grown used to. The wall complained not to be heard, but because it was old and weight, bent even what never softened. Ghost watched her from 10 paces away, seated like a carved guardian in the snow. The dire wolf's coat gathered moonlight until the beast seemed to be made of the same substance as the world's edge. When she met the animal's eyes, the present dropped away for a heartbeat, and a different cold came up through her feet. A cold that did not touch flesh but meaning. The wolf did not bare its teeth, did not come closer. It was enough that he was there. "Your master sleeps," Melisandre said, and Ghost let the words pass as uninteresting weather, turning his head toward the tower that held the boy and the old man, and their ravens. She let him keep his distance. Power liked its own company. So did she, when she could. Morning came grudgingly and cleaved itself into 2 colors, a bruised blue frozen to the sky, and a pale smoke rising from 100 small fires. The yard was already busy. Men moved with shoulders hunched in the way of those who had forgotten summer. Jon Snow was at the hard center of it, the way a stone planted in a stream gathers the water's attention. He had long claw on his hip and a practiced sword in his hand, instructing a knot of green boys, who swung as if hitting air could be coaxed into bleeding. His corrections were not sharp unless the mistake was proud. Then his voice could shave hair. Melisandre watched him work and learned him. He did not perform the patience he lacked. He possessed a patience that did not need to be admired, which was rarer and more dangerous. When he sent the boys away, he stayed to clean the scuffs of boot and blade from the packed snow, as if the yard required order in proportion to his thoughts. "You keep strange hours," Jon said without turning. He knew she was there not because of sound. She made none when she wished, but because the air changed when she entered it. Many men felt it and spoke of sorcery. The boy recognized it as weather and handled it accordingly. "Fire prefers the hours when men admit they are cold," Melisandre said, "and those are not often daylight." He wiped the practiced sword and returned it to the rack, set his shoulders, then faced her. He was the sort of young that did not ask for forgiveness. It asked for fairness and a measure of truth. It was a worse burden than the first, and would take him farther. "What did you see last night?" he asked. He did not waste her time by pretending he did not know she looked. "In the flames." "The snow does not melt," Melisandre answered. "It chooses." "You speak as if snow is someone." "Here it is," she said. "It wears men for a season and lets go when it is done with them. There is a choice before us. Not mine only." John's mouth thinned, the way it did when a decision made itself, and he was still obliged to agree. "Mance has men at our gates. Mance has hunger at his heels," Melisandre said. "The dead have patience forever. Hunger has none. You can make use of that." And peace," John said, testing the word as if it were a stone of doubtful strength. "I've thought on parley. I meant to speak to the Lord Commander." "Speak to him then," she said. "He will tell you a long story about vows and the keeping of them. Old men prefer stories with only one ending. Make him another." They crossed the yard together. Men pretended not to watch. Some of the brothers' eyes followed her, as if she were a rope thrown over a branch with a noose on the end. Others watched John and the wolf's ghost, trailing behind, and saw a different rope, a different branch. Inside the tower, the air had smoke in it, the honest sour of bitter tea and damp wool. Maester Aemon sat at the table with his blind eyes turned toward the light, as if he could borrow sight from it by proximity. Beside him, the Lord Commander's stiff back and whitened mustache were a pair of icicles pretending to be a man. "You've been busy," Jorah Mormont said when he saw Melisandre. He meant, "You have been near my men." "The night does not ask leave to be long," she replied, and smiled with only her eyes at Aemon. "Maester, dot. "A lady's voice," Aemon said, tilting his head as if catching a music that had slipped his grasp. "And a stranger's. Tell me what color your eyes are." "I like to imagine colors I can no longer see." "Red," Melisandre said, and the old man laughed softly as if the jest were shared, though it had not been. "We need to talk of Mance Rayder," John said. He did not seat himself until Jorah gestured. Ghost lay down and sighed like a kettle easing off the boil. "We need to talk of walls," Jorah shot back, "and how they keep when the gate is opened." "Even a closed gate rots if you do not attend to what it is made of," John said. "The free folk are men. Let them through, and they are our problem. Keep them out, and they are the dead's harvest. We make the dead stronger either way. One way we pick the timing." "Not a ranger's thought," Jorah muttered, but his eyes were intent. "It is a steward's, perhaps," Melisandre said, because she wanted him irritated enough to listen. "Stewards know what famine does to men. It makes them simple. Simple men are used by complicated things. The cold is the most complicated thing of all." End. Aemon's fingers found the cup before him and folded around it, not to drink but to remind his hands of a task that had a beginning and an end. "The wall has no enemies it can afford to despise," he said in the slow, precise voice of a man who had learned to make each word do more. "Only those it can afford to misunderstand." Jorah's hand closed on the carved arm of his chair. "I will not barter with oathbreakers." "Then do not call it barter," Melisandre said. "Call it sorting wheat from chaff. Bring them in by tens and hundreds, not en masse. Disarm them. Take their sons for wards for a season or 3. Houses south will send for boys if you do not keep them. There is always a need for hands, and hostages wear many names. Set the free folk to rebuilding the villages in the gift they burned. Make the wall taller with their work. Make the gift a field again instead of a grave. Or stand atop your honor and watch it as it carries them to the coal." Membendawar. Aemon's blind eyes were on John as if he were light itself. Jorah watched John as if the boy were a problem of supply. In both gazes Melisandre saw it, the same stupid, stubborn thing that made men worth the gods' attention. They looked at the boy and saw that he could decide a world. "You are bold to come to my table and tell me how to hold my gate," Jorah said at last. "I am timid," Melisandre said. "If I were bold, I would burn it. Silence is a tool." She put it down like a blade and waited. It shaped the air. A log in the hearth shifted and dropped a little with a whisper of ash. Aemon broke the quiet with a dry scrape of chair. "Let us not spill sense on the floor because it comes in a strange cup," he said. "We will send a flag of truce. A white cloak on a black pole is as good as any. Who bears it?" "Me," Jon said before Azor could say no. "You are too valuable to give to Mance as a piece for his board," Azor said. "Then bring a piece he cannot take," Melisandre said. "Bring me." Azor stared at her, as one might look at a carving that moved. "You will go out among them? I will go to the fire that is to be kindled and see whether it burns," she said. "And I will tell him what waits behind him. He has a king's pride, and kings rarely turn around unless a priest tells them the road is holy." "And this is folly," Azor said, but softly, because the decision had already gone past him. "Take men, rangers. Your wolf, take eyes." "Eyes we have," Aemon murmured. "Do not forget ears." They went past noon, down through a castle of narrow warmths and quick colds, to the gate where the wall briefly admitted that it was an artifice. The winch crew watched Melisandre, as if she might set the ice alight by leaning on it. When the gate moaned open, the world outside was a sheet turned back on a bed no man had slept in for 1,000 nights. "Do not step off the path here," Jon told the 2 boys who came with them to hold the flag and the horn. "The drifts hide hollows that do not give you back. If you see the wolf go right, go right. Go right. Go left if he goes left. If he stands still, he smells something. Do what he does then. If he runs, blow the horn and run faster than him." One of the boys laughed until he saw Jon was not joking. They walked into the light. The haunted forest was not haunted. It was attentive. The trees held their branches close as any northerner would hold a cloak. The snow did the old work of muffling, not out of malice, but because that was its nature. Melisandre moved without sinking, the way a thought crosses a mind. Jon watched everything without turning his head, and looked only occasionally at the place from which danger might come. Ghost's pads made no sound she could hear, but she felt his presence as a tug at her attention every time he shifted. Twice he stopped with one paw lifted, and the party halted, as if a string had tightened around their throats. Once he snarled, deep and without teeth, and a shape drifted away among the trees with the offended dignity of a shadow bumped from a wall. They made the meeting place, a long boulder freckled with snow where no tree stood over it. It had the feel of something the first men had used. Melisandre stood upon it as if it were a step up to a pulpit, and there she made a fire. The wood was stubborn, and the snow took offense. She did not fight it. She balanced. She used small tinder and patience, and let the flames find their own shape. When the first true lick of red rose, she stretched her hands over it as if blessing. Men had already begun to creep from the trees. 2, then 5, then 10, at the rim of sense, from the corners of eyes. They wore the winter the way men in silk wore summer, grudgingly and with pride. Their iron was haphazard, bits of mail like patches on a coat, helms of strange shapes, bone and horn carved to sharpness, not because of savagery, but because winter had no respect for other materials. A woman with a face like a cliff's edge stood with them. Fair hair pulled back under a fur-lined cap. Another woman at her shoulder had eyes like brittle ice, and the look of someone who already knew the end of your story and did not like it. "Well, this is a sight to warm the balls," Tormund Giantsbane announced as he strode openly across the clearing, his beard wearing more frost than snow. "The crowboy come to talk, and he's brought a red witch who smiles like a knife." "I only smile when there is something to cut," Melisandre said. "Plenty of that up here," he said cheerfully. "But we brought you to talk, not to bleed. Mance is come." And Mance Rayder came last, as kings do when they are not fools. He wore no crown and no heraldry, but his presence arranged the air around him, the way a fire makes a room face toward it. His eyes went past Melisandre, the way rain goes past a window, and found Jon's snow. He weighed him, and Melisandre felt the moment the scales ceased to move. "You were the wolf's boy once," Mance said. "Now you've brought a priest." "I've brought what the cold cannot eat," Jon said. "I've not yet seen a god that filled a belly," Mance replied. but I've seen men and women fed by others' fear. Which are you? I'm a man who would not like to die and believes you don't either. John said, honest as a wound. Men have died for less poetic reasons, Mance said. His gaze went to the wolf and back. Tell me your piece. John told him. He did not make it pretty. He spoke of gates and keeping them. He spoke of the gift and the charred bones of small farmsteads, and the fact that bones were poor fences. He spoke of hostages and of warding boys south for a while. He spoke of the dead without horror, which was why the men around Mance listened. He spoke not as a steward or ranger, but as a boy who had gone where men did not return and done the work of returning. Melisandre, for her part, built the rest of the picture, laying her words carefully like stones across a river. She spoke of fire not as a punishment or a god's appetite, but as law. A fire warred with cold the way breathing warred with suffocation, and there would be no negotiation on that, because none was needed. You have a horn, she said when the first quiet fell. You name it Joramun's. If you had such a horn that wakes stone from obedience, the wall would already lie down. What you have is stories. Stories can be used better than horns. Nemtsi. Mance's mouth twitched. And this from a woman of stories. I have a horn. I have men. I have a winter full of people who break when the snow edges itself into their bones, the way bread does when it stales. I have hunger harnessed. What do you have, boy? A gate, John said. And time, if you take it. Dallas' cold blue gaze shifted to Melisandre. And you, red woman? What do you have that men can eat? A promise, Melisandre said, that I will kill what comes behind you if you let me place fire where it needs to be. That I will teach your wise women and your fools both to hold a brand and make it mean something. That I will not ask you to bow to a word, only to stand where the cold is and not let it pass you. You speak like a woman who has never watched a child wail through the night and then stop because crying is a luxury, said the fair-haired woman. Val, if Melisandre's remembered lore served. You speak of promises that boil away the instant a kitchen runs out of flour. I speak as a woman who has taken the fire into herself and had it look back, Melisandre said. You think I do not know hunger? I have eaten nothing but flame for years. Men think that is a metaphor. Men like metaphors. The cold does not. The wind pushed at the fire as if to test her. She steadied it without hands. It grew taller by the width of a finger and warmer by the thickness of a thought. The men shifted their weight toward it, even though pride forbade it. Tormund cleared his throat. Words are wind, and wind is useful when it fills a sail. We can spend the day measuring each other's lungs, or we can say aye or no, and then figure how the saying is to be done. Mance looked at John for a long time. You say you take boys as wards. Wards, fosterlings. Hostages, call it what you like, John said. It is a way of making one people from two that do not trust each other. It is a way of giving a boy two fathers, so he can come back and teach both how to stand without reaching for their swords every time a door opens. And if the boy is taken and never returned, then I will come and take him, John said. He did not look at Melisandre when he said it. He did not look at the wolf. And if he is dead, then I will come and make someone live with that mistake as long as I do. Silence again, only the fire talking. The free folk were not stupid. They heard the shape of what he promised and measured it. One more thing, Melisandre said, because she felt the world tilting. You must let me set fires in your camps. Small fires to begin with. Circles placed where I say, and no dead you love must be burned in them. They did not ask why. Those who had seen enough winter already knew. The dead did not always stay where they were put. Mance's eyes flickered. He had lost a brother, perhaps a child. He knew what it was to carry a memory that did not want to be carried. We will come, he said at last, as if the words had been settled long ago and all this were ceremony. We will come by the 100. The Magnar's thens will not like it. They prefer their peace to be an axe. They can stay behind and starve if they like. The rest will come. We will put men south of a wall, because behind us are things that do not know men and never will, and we prefer the company of what we can fight. We will bring the horn for your maester to argue with. We will bring our women and our old. We will bring our small. We will bring our grudges, because you cannot ask a man to leave them. He would have to tear off part of his skin. But we will come. Niao Sao. And you will give hostages, John said. And you will give yours, Mance replied, mild as a summer afternoon. If we are to trust your gate, you will send men into our camps, not as spies, but as guarantees. Your red woman can plant her circles in our snow. Your wolf can sniff our cooking pots if it keeps his teeth to himself. You will sit by our fires and listen to stories that make your gods frown. If I sit by your fire and frown, it will be because your stories are dull, John said, and Tormund barked a laugh that fogged his beard. They returned to the wall under a sky that had acquired a weather of small glittering knives. The wind shifted, and with it, something else moved. Ghosts' hackles rose. Melisandre felt the cold that was not air tasting the edges of the day, and drew her cloak closer, not for warmth but to trap the shape of the prayer inside it. At the gate, the winchman stared. Yor was there by the time the iron teeth were lifted, and Aemon's blind head turned toward the smell of men who were not his. The first 10 free folk came with them, their weapons left in a heap out in the snow that had already begun to swallow the iron. Strip the blades, Gior said. Count heads. Put them in the old barracks by the east wall. Kitchens, double the gruel and say a prayer over it if you spare one. Maester, you'll want to look at coughs and fevers. We are rich in those. Kindness is a currency, Lord Commander, Aemon said. But it is not counterfeit-proof. Spend carefully. Men grumbled with their hands. They did it near enough to be heard, and far enough to be denied. The free folk answered with stares that could kill the fleas on a dog's back. One of the thens spat, missed the wolf, and rethought his day. They will curse you, Jor told John when the first group had been settled with straw and suspicion. Some for letting them in, some for not letting them in fast enough, some for keeping your sword too close. Some for not keeping it close enough. That is the way of a command. I did not ask for command, John said. Yor's mustache bent into something that might have been a smile if it had warmed. No one worth giving it to does. That night, Melisandre did not go to the brazier. She moved through the camp instead, a red seam falling through black cloth. She set small shapes in the snow at the corners of buildings and kindled them with a sliver of song. Fire, like men, responded to being called by its true name. The flames did not leap. They settled and argued with the dark as old married things will. Constant, not because they had no other choice, but because they preferred each other to cold. Priest, Tormund said quietly beside her, because his feet were lighter than any man had a right to expect. You mean to keep the dead from walking? I mean to keep the living from becoming what the dead have to use, she said. When you wake in the night and feel a cold that your blanket does not understand, bring a brand from one of these and circle your door with it. Aye, he said, as if talking to someone who had given him good advice about an axe edge. I, in the days that followed the wall, learned a new sound. Children. Quiet ones at first, because their mothers told them the night's teeth were listening. But laughter leaks. It ran out under doors and around corners, and through the frost-hardened yards, and men who had not heard it in years found themselves turning toward it with expressions they did not recognize. Fight it as they might, the brothers of the Night's Watch began to teach the children the small crafts that kept fingers from freezing and minds from going dull. A brother who had forgotten he could carve made a whistle. Another one unthinkingly tied a red string around a little girl's wrist to keep her to her mother in a crowd, and then blushed for having done something so soft. The free folk women taught a pair of green boys to tan hides properly, without making their hands bleed. Someone swapped a pot of stew for a bundle of dry pine cones because the smell of them was the smell of days that had not yet been used up. Someone stole. Someone was beaten. Someone returned the thing and found a slice of bread waiting on the step next morning, as if a house had decided to be generous. Not all men learned. The thens glowered and ate and glowered again. A brawl exploded outside the armory, and John stood on a barrel and shouted until the noise fell under his, then climbed down and spoke to the worst of them softly, until a bigger man on his own side took him away by the shoulder. He slept less and ate when someone put food into his hand, and forgot when they did not. The wolf slept too, but always with one ear turned. Melisandre watched the boy become the man the fire had spoken of, and remembered with a pang that prophecy is not for the prophet's comfort. In the third night, a wind came that was not a wind. It tasted of iron made into glass, and it turned the flames pale as if they were being examined. The first wight stumbled into the circle by the old bell tower and stopped when it felt the heat. It had been a hunter or a thief or a man who could not run fast enough. It wore enough humanity for a child to recognize what it had been and scream. The circle held. The thing jerked and rattled like a trapped kettle and fell as if its legs had simply remembered they belonged to a different command. The brothers came with axes and chopped it after the fashion that had lately become doctrine. Separate the limbs, burn what you can, put the ashes into a barrel with a layer of salt. Doctrine made the fearful feel like they had learned etiquette. Another came at the western stockade. Melisandre was there with her small fire already in her hands, the flame coiled around her fingers like a bracelet. She did not throw it. She stepped forward and set it in the snow between the wight and the children huddled in the shadow of the wall, and then stepped back and spoke one word that was not the name of fire, but fire's self-respect. The wight's head turned toward her, as if the syllable had tugged on a string in its neck. John came then, long claw in his hands, the blade dull and honest and personal. He cut once, and a clean line became two unclean lines. The wolf worried the hand that still reached as if the fingers had a separate wanting. The boys who had held the flag on the first day stood with spears and did not jab or flee. When it was done, John's breath steamed like a kettle, and his eyes went to Melisandre. "This was not a fight," he said. "It was a rehearsal," she answered. In the morning, the ravens beat the air black. The night had taken something from the watch that could not be spared, and left something in its place that could not be ignored. Azor moved like a man who had aged a week in a night and called for a council. Which was to say, he opened his door, and men came because they needed someone to draw lines on a blank map. "We will continue," Azor said when all had said their say, and the say had formed a pile that would not be climbed. "The gate stays open at my command. We fill what we can of the gift with people who know how to make a cold land yield. We feed what we can. We keep the dead out with fire, and the living in with rule. If any man does not like it, he can go out beyond the wall and explain himself to whatever still walks there." "And Sawal?" "And the south?" a man asked. "We'll need grain, timber, iron. The north is emptied of much that can be spared. The south will come whether we ask for it or not," Azor said. "There is a king on the march. He will arrive to find we have saved him men to rule." The name Stannis Baratheon moved through the room like a draft, chilling and lifting the hair on men's arms. John looked down at his hands and saw that he had been cut by something he had not watched. He did not suck the blood away. He let it mark him. When the king came, he came out of a storm that had more order than most armies. His banners snapped like judgments. His knights were iron made into contempt. He rode under a crown he could not be dissuaded from wearing, even when wind made it into a thing that assaulted his dignity. He saw the free folk gathered in lines outside the gate, not as supplicants, but as impatient men in a queue who feared losing their place, and he did not stop. He rode through the gate with his jaw set and his eyes weighing. And beside him, the Onion Knight's weathered face turned and took in more than the king did, because that was the habit of men who survived kings. Melisandre stood on the inner yard with her flame hidden and her face bare. She wore the red not as a threat but as an announcement. "I will not pretend to be something else today." When Stannis' horse stamped on the hard-packed snow and the steam rose from its nostrils like flags, he stared at her as if she were a letter he had not expected to receive. "Lady," he said, and his voice had the gravel of a man who had run out of sand to grind, "we find you in a place not of our planning." "Your grace," she said, inclining her head. "The fire goes where it is needed." "It goes where I send it," he said automatically, and then his eyes passed to John and lingered. "Lord Snow," Davos Seaworth said quietly. a small warmth hidden in the winter of his tone. "We meet at last. I have heard of your work and your wolf. I hope the one recommends the other," John said, and Davos smiled with his eyes. Stannis looked past the boy to the free folk, and the lines of small fires planted like punctuation in the snow. He saw not piety but engineering. "You bring raiders into my realm and call it mercy," he said without heat. "Perhaps it is sense. Perhaps it is treason. Perhaps the world has decided it has no use for those words anymore." "It is war," Melisandre said. "But the enemy is not a man and does not need a throne. Throne wars have rules, and the cold knows none." "You spoke once to a fire and asked for a crown," she said. "For him alone. The fire listened to your strength. It will not abandon you because it has found a different use for its favorite steel." "Dan, you speak as if I am a sword to be set down when the wielder is bored," Stannis said. She watched the offense pass through him and be used, like wind through a windmill. "You are a sword," she said. "Only there is more than one hand. The boy is the hand that will do the work here. Your work lies south and west, in Deepwood Mud, in the Dreadfort, in Winterfell. Places that still belong to men and require a king's law to make them remember whose." Stannis did not flinch. Pride did not make him stupid. It made him removing. He removed himself from the problem he did not need to solve. He stared at Jon until the boy felt the weight, as if it had hands. And then he nodded, as if everything were now placed in a sequence acceptable to him. "Very well," he said. "You will hold the wall and make your peace with those who call themselves free. You will answer to me when asked, and not until. I will not have my command clogged with reports of how many potatoes were stolen from a sour-faced farmer. I will take what men you can spare who do not flinch at the sight of a keep. I will use winter as it uses us. And you, boy, will not lecture me on honor unless you have grown a beard I can grip." "Oh, I will try to disappoint you, your grace," Jon said, and Davos coughed to hide his laugh. Afterward, Melisandre went to her brazier for the first time in days. The fire showed her things have their habits. It showed her a girl with a grayscaled face whose laughter had the sound of hope, stubborn enough to be a vice. It showed her a shadow making a king's brother into a story men would not tell their sons. It showed her a castle where a red woman put her hands into the very worst kind of prayer and came out with bones. It showed her again the boy, amid snow that had learned to be an ally. It showed her the free folk walking through the gate into a land that was not their own. And it showed her the dead learning to object to that with patience. Prophecy was a series of doors. The trick was to let the right ones stay shut long enough to find a different hallway. She doused the brazier with a handful of new snow and listened to it hiss. Outside, the yard had gathered a new weather, men teaching each other how to light a brand, women studying how to mend mail, a king's men learning to be less offended at the smell of tallow, a boy with a wolf on his heels learning how to hold a gate open without letting the world walk him down. On a morning when the light lay thin and indecisive over the ice like honey spread too far, Jon rode out again north of the wall with a dozen men and the red woman and the wolf, to set another meeting place and another circle of flame where there had been none. The trees made the same old sounds. The snow produced the same new silence. Tormund came with a loaf under his arm made of something that pretended to be bread in winter and shared it unasked, tearing pieces and handing them with the casual dignity of a lord who had forgotten to bring servants. Ygritte moved a little apart and did not look at Jon while she looked at him. "We're all fools," she said when they stood too near not to hear each other's hearts. "Aye," he said, and could not think of anything else worth saying. "You brought my people south," she said. "Some of them will die in beds now. You've done them a cruelty." "It is a good cruelty," he said. "Some kinds are," she said, and the corner of her mouth betrayed her. She went to the fire and warmed her hands over it as if taking an oath. Val watched this as if memorizing how to be at peace without giving anything away. Dalla closed her eyes briefly, a queen making room within herself for something she had not thought to store. They set the circle. It sputtered at first, because the snow had a will. Melisandre coaxed it, speaking to it as if a child in a tantrum. Then it caught, and the light settled itself into the world. Not triumphant, but content. The men around it visibly eased. Ghost lifted his head and sniffed the air and rumbled a warning so low it felt like being addressed by the ground. They all turned as one toward the line of the trees. What came was not a host. It was a shape that had not been a man for longer than anyone here had been alive. It moved with a skater's calm and wore frost like a robe. Its eyes were blue in the sense that fire is red. It stopped at the edge of the circle as a curious dog will stop at a stream and consider its depth. Joan's hand went to Longclaw because that is what hands do. Melisandre's hand went to the small brand tucked in her belt because that is what hands will learn. The thing tilted its head as if to say, "Ah, it knows we are here." She said, as if the others had not yet realized their own existence. "It knows we are together." "It does not like it," Tormund said, pleased. "It does not know what it likes," Melisandre said. "We will teach it dislike." The thing made no sound and yet somehow conveyed amusement. Then it turned and moved away, its disdain so complete, it did not bother to pretend it was retreat. Men breathed again. Women breathed. The wolf grunted as if insulted by its etiquette. Melisandre kept the brand in her hand until the fire had finished saying what it needed to say. It would not be the last time the cold came to take their measure. It would not be the last time men mistook a test for a battle or a rehearsal for the real. There would be a time when the circles failed and would need to be remade, farther back, tighter, arranged into a geometry that men did not usually live inside. There would be arguments about grain that felt like knives more than bread. There would be mistakes. There would be triumphs that looked like mistakes to those who had preferred a different story. For now, there was a boy with a man's mouth and a wolf that knew the shape of him. There was a red woman who had chosen flame as her language and would learn to translate it into other men's hunger. There were free folk stubborn enough to learn to stand without running, and brothers of the Night's Watch stubborn enough to admit that sometimes standing looked like opening the door. At night, when the world had gone to its knees and was pretending to sleep, Melisandre walked the inner yard and counted the small circles she had set. She did not count to ensure they were there. She counted to teach the cold that counting was a kind of ownership, and the living intended to keep it. In one of the circles a child had placed a pebble, a smooth gray oval with a line of black like a river, and for a moment she saw not the pebble but a stone egg, the sort that had slept in ashes and hatched under a sky that remembered dragons. The vision dissolved as quickly as breath, leaving her with a pebble again, and she laughed. A rare sound, quiet and pleased with nothing but itself. Azor, Ahai. She said softly, the way a woman might speak a child's name as she put him to bed. The fire in the circle lifted a little, as if hearing a song far off and wanting to go, and she put her palm over it with affection. Sleep, she told the flame. We have time yet. In the raven's loft, feathers made restless edits to the darkness. In the old brew house, someone had hung sprigs of dead herbs for the smell of memory. In the long hall, men lay like drifted snow and breathed. In his chamber, Jon sat with Longclaw across his knees and did not touch it, aware in the strange way new leaders are of every place his skin met, wood or cloth, as if he were being measured by the very chair. The wolf lay with his head on Jon's boot and dreamt running. Beyond the gates, the queue of the free folk moved like a slowed river, patient because there was no other choice, and not so patient that it did not murmur. The circles of fire burned. Small suns that refused to worship bigger ones. The wall made its old groaning, a ship carrying a cargo it had not chosen. The cold waited, intelligent and insulted and learning. A bad student who would one day become a terrible teacher if allowed. And somewhere beneath all that sound and silence, in the place where prophecy sighs, the way a bellows breathes, an old promise turned over and faced the light. Okay. The fire circles were small enough that a man could mistake them for stove-bright tricks, but men did not mistake them twice. They learned the way a hand learns to close around a tool. Slowly, with the skin complaining, and the joints stiff. And then all at once, finding the shape was made for them. They learned to step inside the circles without thinking, and to sleep with their feet toward the glow. They learned to prop their spears so that a waking hand could find the point first, and to set their boots upside down so frost would not gather where a heel wanted to go. A man's soul is a long winter of habits. Castle Black added new ones, one ember at a time. Messages went out as bread does, in slices. Eamon dictated them with the slow care of a mason, and John wrote. His hand cramped less each day. Names found their way onto the page like ships nosing into a tight harbor. Manderley of White Harbor, Glover of Deepwood, Serwyn, Flint, Tallheart's cousins who still held a hedge of land you could not see without knowing where to look. To some he wrote of grain and barter. To others he wrote only of the cold that walked with a man's shape. To all he wrote of peace and the price of it. In the corner of every letter, where the parchment seemed to sag with the weight of all the words, Eamon added a line as if he were stitching a wound closed. Let it not be said that the wall fell because men would not share bread. Davos watched him write, a quiet man's way of standing guard. His fingers were scarred into honesty. He could not hide the life they had lived, even when his mouth chose not to tell it. You'll want to send a few on fast horses, the Onion Knight said, tapping one letter with a nail that had grown back thick and square. Manderley will send food if it means he can look south and tell himself he feeds the realm. Better if he can say he does it before the king asks. Pride spends sweeter than coin. John nodded. He thought of White Harbor's fat boats and the way the river iced over by inches rather than all at once. What of the Umbers? Which ones? Davos' mouth tilted. You'll get a different answer depending on who answers. Send it anyway, John said. If a man's house is divided, no letter can make it whole. But the sight of a name written as if it will be read does a thing to pride. Eamon's blind head lifted. You speak like a maester who has not yet grown tired of hope. I speak like a steward who has learned hope weighs less than wheat, but is easier to carry far, John said. He wrote another letter. This one with fewer words and more space between them. He pressed his seal, a direwolf's head borrowed from a brother who had gone south and not come back, and tried not to think of what this stolen mark meant. The wax hardened under his thumb. He pulled away and left a neat impression of something that might yet return from a long winter. Hostages, wards, John insisted, though Jour's mouth did not respect the difference. Arrived not with ceremony but in a bundle of moments that counted without being numbered. A boy with hair like straw and eyes like the sky before snow came with Tormund. His chin lifted as if he understood that courage does not like to be announced. A girl with a fox, narrow cleverness clung to Dallas' skirts and then let go because to cling is a child's habit, and she had decided she had left childhood the night before. 3 then boys came together and stood in one another's shadow, as if the light harmed them less that way. Val did not send a child. She came herself, folding her arms and standing in the hall like winter personified, nodding once as if to say, I am here and you will take me into your keeping, and regret it if you do not. John bowed to none of them and bowed to all. You will sleep under our roof, he told the straw-haired boy. Only if the roof does not leak, the boy said. The corner of his mouth quirked as if he dared a beating for insolence, and would be offended not to receive it. It leaks where it pleases, John said. We learn to set buckets when it does. The boy laughed then, relief making him younger. Buckets, then. Buckets, Tormund echoed, clapping the boy on the back in approval large enough to knock him 3 steps forward. We'll make a crow of you yet, and if you become one, I'll tell your mother and she'll eat me with salt. You'll be stringy, Val said without looking at him. Too much weather in you. You forget the fat of good stories, Tormund said, patting his middle. That cooks sweet. The then boys were brick-faced and quiet. John took them to the forge and set them to the bellows. Sweat is an argument that never loses. They learned faster there than they would have under any lecture. One black-haired then put his palm flat on the warming stone and did not flinch until his flesh told him it had been hurt. He blinked, set his jaw, and kept working. The smith, a man with more arm than patience, grunted grudging respect. You'll do, he said. praise at the wall is always a magic. Melisandre watched this exchange with the analytic attention she gave to flames when they showed her nothing. She took her measure not in heat, but in results. A ward sleeping beneath a different roof was a ward whose mother dressed her fear in other clothes. A boy sweating at a bellows was a boy learning to feed fire properly and not with panic. These were circles too, she thought. A different kind of magic, one that men did not think of as such, because it did not require a word they could not pronounce. All magic is a matter of teaching the world to accept a pattern. You take in theirs, Jor said when they stood at the gate, watching Mance's second hundred come across the hard snow. Whose will you send to them? Mine, Jon said, without knowing whether he meant brothers or the pieces of himself he had no use for in a place that required other shapes. I will sit at their fires. I will send men who can listen without promising what they cannot give. Gren will go. Pip, Donal Noy will go when he is not needed to curse at iron. The old man you like to keep at the top of the West Tower can go and tell the story of every sparrow he's ever seen. They will not trust us because of it. They will trust us eventually because trust uses itself up slower when someone is watching it. Oh, pretty wisdom, Jor said. He did not disagree. He never said yes when a no would serve. He watched the next group approach, and his hand tightened on the butt of his stick when he noticed the Magnar of then did not come. The absence wore its own armor. Styr sits his men and waits to count who starves, Tormund said later, shrugging his cloak off and steam rising from him, as if he had been a bread loaf pulled from an oven. He's too proud to pass your gate and too hungry to walk away. He'll pick fights where he thinks he can call them tests. He'll send boys to steal the iron hoops from your barrels so he can tell himself he's making war. Then we will sleep with our barrels and call it peace, Jon said. If he wants to test, we will give him a measure. Men hate nothing more than being given an honest measure. And so, they set a line of men on the outer path, not to guard the gate, which could be shut regardless of how many stood there, but to keep the peace where peace tends to fray, at the edge of a line. The first night, a then youth tried to take a kettle from an old brother who had polished it with sand until he could see a younger face in it. The youth received a crack on the wrist and a crack at his pride. He took both with narrow-eyed dignity and returned the next day with a bowl and a question about how to keep water from tasting of old iron. The old brother grunted and showed him how to rub it with stale bread and salt. You'll waste bread, the youth said, offended and delighted. You waste less water, the old man said. A bargain had been struck without anyone admitting to it. Melisandre walked the camp as if making an inventory of a temple. Queen's men began to find her presence less alarming and more inconvenient, like a neighbor who always remembered to ask for what you forgot to fetch. A scowling knight with a yellow beard stopped her by the new-made shrine they had raised to their red god, crossbar and post. No image, and gestured toward the nearest heart tree visible beyond the wall's shadow, its pale face peering from a copse of snow-powdered elder. You'll have these down when his grace orders it, the knight said. His tone made the order a memory and a threat. No, Melisandre said, with the small, courteous interest of someone asked to move a mountain that had sat comfortably for 10,000 years. I will not burn a heart tree. You burned 7 at Dragonstone, he said, spitting the words like gristle. 7 gods carved by men's hands, she said. 7 shapes used to hold a kind of fear. This is a different thing. Burn a heart tree, and you set a beacon the cold will follow. Because the old gods do not stir, and stirring is offense to what walks. These trunks have eyes carved, yes. The eyes are not for adoration. They are for watching. I prefer them watching on our side. Encio. Blasphemy, he said. But his anger cooled under confusion. He had never considered the long patience of the wood as a tactical asset. Faith makes poor generals unless trained. Look to your shrine, she said. Keep fire there and men around it at night. Teach them to be able to speak the names. Not because names bind the fire, but because men do, and this helps them remember why their mouths were given them. I will come and light it at sunset. We can argue afterward. You make bargains in the posture of prayer, he said. I pray when I must and bargain when I can. She said, both are currencies, and I am not rich enough to waste either." He snorted, grudging, then chuckled. He did not like her more for it. He respected her less. Respect is not affection. It is a denser coin. News began to return as if tied to the legs of a raven that had arrived thin and fed itself fat on what it found. From east of the Milkwater, a band had been seen moving with torches at midday, their fire too blue, their shadows too long. From a half-buried village, half a day's slog north of the Shadow Tower, a man came back with a hand that did not bleed when cut and an expression like glass, until he reached the nearest circle and fell as if death had called loudly. From the fist of the first men came a rumor and a bag of dragonglass arrowheads, found where a man with fat hands and a coward's heart had dropped them. The rumor was that a boy had stabbed another and lived long enough to be terrified of having done something final. The boy's name was not told. There are names men keep back, because to say them is to wound them more deeply. John split the arrowheads without keeping any for himself. He gave more to the free folk than the brothers, and watched the expressions climb and fall like shutters in wind. "Fire and black glass," he told them. "If you cannot have one, use the other, preferably both. Put the tips into hot resin and pray to whatever you were taught to pray to that the resin holds. They'll break," one then said, testing the spine of two with his thumbnail and making a face of contempt when they did not crumble easily. "So will you," John said. And the then looked up sharply and then laughed, short and pleased. Pride, scolded, sometimes behaves. Melisandre tested the glass in her own way, not to prove its hardness but to understand the sound it made when a tongue of flame found it. In her palm, an arrowhead warmed until it sang. Flame knows friends and medicines. She went to the weirwood that watched their camp and set her palm against the pale trunk. The cold lived there as wine lives in a cup, held by the shape it had been given. She did not try to drink it. She acknowledged a presence old enough to be bored by men's wars and wise enough to choose boredom over malice. For a heartbeat, the face carved into the bark looked less like an old man's weeping and more like a watcher shading his eyes. It was enough. "Lady," a voice said behind her, thin and brave as the seam of a cut that has not yet scabbed. She turned to find the straw-haired ward. He stood with his hands stuffed under his arms to keep his fingers warm without glove. "Is it true you can make yourself warm just by wanting? Wanting is a fire," she said. "Sometimes it cooks the meat, sometimes it burns the house. And so, what do you want?" he asked, so directly she had to pause to reward the honesty. "I want the night to keep its distance," she said, "and those who live under it to learn that they do not have to be eaten in order to be recognized." He considered this and then nodded, as if she had told him the way to cheat at a game and not be caught. "I want to grow a beard by next winter," he confided. "Tormund says a beard is a hand you grow on your face to hold the weather. Tormund is a poet." She said solemnly. "He says he is a lover, not a poet," the boy said, eyes bright with something like hero worship and something like a son mocking a father to make himself taller. "But he tells his stories like he's pouring honey. They stick better than water. That is all poetry wants," she said. "To stick." Ygritte came and went around John like the wind does around a roofline. Sometimes quiet, sometimes making a complaint of the eaves. They spoke in short words beneath longer looks. She did not forgive him because there was nothing to forgive. She did not forget him because forgetting requires never having understood. Once he found her watching the children practice with sticks, whacking at the round shields a black brother had fashioned from barrel lids. She had an exasperated affection on her face and a small frown for the way the smallest boy put his feet wrong and the tallest girl swung with her shoulder instead of her hip. "You'd make a good instructor," John said. "I'd make a bad wife," she said, then pressed her lips together as if the words had surprised her with their cruelty. She rubbed at her arms. "I'm not made for walls, Jon Snow, even ones that hold back dead men. I'm made for skies bigger than a room and for hills that let you learn them. If I stay, I'll find a way to hate what you're making. If I go, I'll find a way to guard it anyway. Then go, he said, because the man who keeps a wild thing under his roof discovers quickly he has released a different beast into his bed. But come back when you need fire. She nodded. She did not kiss him or turn aside. She walked away with a particular economy of movement that says a decision has been paid for in advance. The next week, Stannis sent south toward the Dreadfort, his army a black stitch across a white garment. He left behind a portion of Queen's men who did not look at the free folk directly, and the smell of judgment as if it were perfume. Selisa and the girl came later than the king. The way rain comes after thunder has gone, unwanted but inevitable. Shireen's face was a map that had been roughly corrected. The grayscale's legacy gave her a shyness she used like a curtain, stepping behind it when men's eyes scraped. Melisandre went to her without ceremony and knelt, a small courtesy that made the hall inhale. "Do you read?" Melisandre asked. "Only everything," Shireen said, then looked mortified at her own boldness. "I mean, I like to." "It makes the time sit down. I have a few words you may not yet know," Melisandre said. "But you will. You will teach them to others." Queen Selisa watched them with her mouth tight. A woman who has found a faith that explains her enemies is a woman who has set aside the harder work of understanding her friends. She spoke stiffly of piety and wanted to burn something because burning had made sense of grief once. Melisandre did not give her wood. She gave her tasks. Lists of names and numbers, larders to inspect, bandages to fold. Sometimes faith must be exhausted physically before it will sit quietly enough to listen. "Your Grace," Melisandre said in the Queen's hearing a day later, "the God of light is not a god of smoke. He does not want us to turn every absence into incense." "You speak lightly of sacrifice," Selise said, her nostrils flaring not unlike an offended mare. "I speak as someone who has made it often enough to know what it does and what it does not," Melisandre said. "Fire is generous. Give it something it can use. A song, a circle, a man who watches through the night and does not fall asleep. And it makes more from it than you gave. Give it a child, and you teach it the taste of loss instead of the habit of victory." "Menan." Selisa's gaze sharpened, her natural severity briefly opening into something that might have been a tear if tears did not offend her theology. She said nothing. She did not need to. The warning had moved into the air and stayed there, weightless and undeniable. Steer eventually came, because hunger argues and wins. He did not use the gate. He stood beyond it and shouted for Mance to answer to a king. He declared that he would rather eat his own men than kneel for soup to crows. He laughed about circles and fire and said he would piss them out. He broke 3 of them and learned the way men learn the rules of stone, by banging their heads against it. His boys began to show up at the practice yard the week after. Sullen, then attentive, then competitive. Their fury turned into a kind of ambition that respected a mark well made. The Magnar ceased to shout and began to send demands written on slats of wood with the tips charred. Jon answered them with barrels of oats and a list of names of thens who had broken no bones in the last 3 days. Sometimes a war bleeds off into accounting, and both sides live longer for it. On a day when the light came in like a visitor late to a meal, the first of Manderley's carts reached the bottom of the wall, moving in a little caravan pulled by oxen that puffed as if the cold were new to them. Men lifted sacks with the reverence of pious thieves. A white-bearded man with a nose like a hawk's beak hollered instructions in a voice that made horses relax. He handed Jon a letter wrapped in oiled cloth with the absurd flourish of a courtier. "From Lord Wyman," he said. "He writes long when he cannot travel. Men who do not walk far make their words do it for them." Jon broke the wax and read. The letter smelled faintly of cloves and ink that had decided to be a perfume. Lord Wyman wrote of duty and the sea, which he loved because it gave the appearance of freedom to men who obeyed its laws without knowing them. He wrote that the North fed its own when it could and its neighbors when it had to, because a winter that eats your neighbor will come for you next. He wrote a confession of indulgence, a night with a platter of lampreys too rich, and excused it by saying a man cannot fast for a whole season without losing his taste for feasts. He signed with a flourish that made it clear he was laughing at himself. "Little and not little," John said, folding the letter back along the crease of its intent. "Lord Wyman will feed you as long as he can tell himself he is feeding the story of the North," Davos murmured. "And he is. He is." The carts were emptied with the ruthless efficiency of hunger. Brothers and free folk together stood in lines and lifted and passed and sat down and nodded. Azor watched with his head cocked minutely to one side, as if listening to a tune he had once danced to and could not quite whistle. Aemon sat near one of the circles and warmed his hands while counting sacks aloud, the numbers steady as a prayer. "Do you always count aloud?" Melisandre asked. "It keeps the number honest," he said. "Numbers prefer to change in the dark." "All things do," she said. "Except fire. Fire is a habit," he said. "Cold is a habit. Men choose between them 100 times a day. They forget they're choosing because the work of it is small and constant and feels like breathing." Nas. "Who chose you?" She had not meant to ask it. The question leapt and hung in the air like breath that had turned to ice. "The family I was born into," he said mildly, and in the calm of it she heard a life's worth of storms. "The chain I put on. A woman I did not marry. A winter that needed me to sit and keep a record of who ate what and when they died. Choice and fate wear one another's clothes when they are tired." A horn sounded that was not alarm and not honor. A short, practical call that meant a knot of trouble was tripping over its own feet in the south yard. John left the counting and went. Ghost went without being told. Melisandre followed because the air tugged her cloak in that direction, and she had learned to listen to how cloth behaves when fate pulls it. They found 3 thens and 2 brothers, locked not in a fight, but in a rehearsal for one. Their words, the sort of stories men tell themselves right before someone bleeds. He looked at me. He took what was mine. He spoke low to make me hear a challenge where he was too much a coward to speak it loud. A pot lay on its side, stew thickening in the cold into a paste that would be inedible when it finished this alchemy. The thing itself was nothing. What sat under it would become something if given time. "This is mine," said a brother with ears red from the cold and pride. "It has my mark. Your mark looks like everyone's," a then boy said with frustrated logic. He held up the pot's bottom, where a scratch did indeed resemble a dozen others. "Your scratch is the same scratch 1,000 men make when they pretend the iron knows their name. An old brother taught me to make it that way," the brother said. "If you do not like it, make your own." "Hold," John said. He took the pot, turned it in his hands, and set it upright. He looked not at the men, but at the stew clinging to the inside lip and beginning to freeze. When food lies in the snow, it becomes the snows. Anyone who eats it afterward puts cold inside himself that his blanket will not forgive. "Old women's talk," the then scoffed. But he took a step back because men's bodies believe health tales when their mouths do not. "Give him your pot," John said to the brother. "It is mine," the man said. But the words lacked heat. The wind had carried it away for him. "Your mark is a scratch," John said, the gentleness making the words heavier. "Make me another, a different scratch we can all recognize. Teach 2 free folk to make it too. Show them you trust them to guard your iron as their own. Then scratch the new mark on 10 pots and keep none for yourself. The rest us will sort as we sort everything, with mouths and argument and a day's work." "Mensau, this is justice?" the brother asked skeptically. "This is a rope we will all hold until we can pull something better," John said. "It is what we have." The then grunted. "You are a crow with a full belly, Lord Snow. It is easy to be generous with other men's things when your wolf scares hunger away from your door. Mamnasi, you are welcome to hold his tail while I sleep," John said, and the then laughed before he could help it. He wiped at the stew spatter on his trousers with the careless disgust of a man who remembers having been a boy. That night, the wind changed and the sky slid its blue aside for a stretch of black stars. that looked as if someone had thrown a handful of salt into a well, and the salt had decided to stay. The circles burned small and steady. Melisandre went from one to the next with a jar of rendered fat and a stick to push each flame's coat back from its face. She paused at the fourth circle, the one set by the old barracks under a shard of wall. The masons were forever promising to fix when the stones thawed. The flame did not need her. It leaned toward her anyway. Curious. "Lady," Aemon said from the bench beside the circle. He had wrapped his chain in cloth to keep it from biting his throat. "May I ask you something that may sound like an old man prodding his memory for places to hide?" "You may," she said. "Do you truly believe the boy is the prince that was promised?" She did not answer immediately. A lying answer given to a blind man is still a lie, and one of the few luxuries she allowed herself was an economy of them. "I believe he's the sword that needs the fewest blows to make the most difference," she said. "I believe his shape fits the lock that is most likely to open the door we need. I believe prophecy is so fond of irony that it prefers to be wrong on the small facts in order to be right in the large, and I do not care whether the boy's name matches a rhyme so long as his hand holds where it must." "And you speak like a maester who has been taught to distrust poetry," Aemon said, smiling. And she smiled back because old men who had sat out their storms deserved that small exchange of warmth. "I was not always a priest," she said. "Once I was a girl who needed a story to tell herself in order to live long enough to become a woman who did not." "Most of us are," he said. When she left him, she went to John's door without thinking. He sat with Longclaw across his knees again, the habit less a prayer now than a conversation with a friend who had learned to listen without interrupting. "Stannis will write to you," she said. "He will ask for men. He will not say please because he believes duty is its own courtesy." "I will send those who can be spared," John said. "Donal Noy says men are iron poured into different molds. Some are nails, and some are knives, and some are things for which no word exists until a need arises. Donal Noy is a smith," she said. "You trust his metaphors. Good. Most battles are fought in the forge first and finished on the field." He looked at her. "Do you ever sleep?" "When the air spends itself," she said. "When my head convinces my hands they will not be needed for an hour." "I thought priests had gods that rocked them like babies," he said. And his mouth softened with the momentary arrogance of youth, teasing a power he had decided not to fear. "We do," she said. "But gods are terrible singers." He laughed, surprised into it. Ghost twitched in his sleep and thumped his tail twice against the floorboards. The morning brought a frost so fine it could have been mistaken for dust. The sun came up and did nothing about it. A scavenging band of whites tested a circle near the rookery and were repelled by nothing more dramatic than stubborn flame and a boy who held his spear properly. Another band split around a circle and tried to step across at once. The fire's edge taught them the respect of children being introduced to a hot kettle. A third band did not come at all, and that, more than the others, worried Melisandre. She stood in the yard and looked north as if the horizon had become a letter she had not finished reading. "Lady?" Tormund said, following her gaze. "Do you see your god learning new tricks? I see the absence of something that should have had the pride to announce itself," she said. "The longer a silence is held, the louder the noise it hides." "Then our ears will ache soon," he said, scratching at his beard as if he could remove a thought with the same satisfaction as a flea. "Best tell the cooks to have hot soup on when the worst of it is done. A man who eats after staring at what isn't right convinces himself he has outlived it." "And shall we will need pitch," she said, "and oil. Not for the walls but for lines on the ground. I will show you the pattern." "I was hoping you would say wine," he sighed. "But pitch will do. It sticks almost as well." "And shall." They laid the lines at dusk, Melisandre marking with a pointed stick and Tormund following with a barrel on a sledge. His sons and sons' friends dragging another. Free folk women uncomplaining in the cold, black brothers in their plain wool doing the work without talk because the wind stole anything above a murmur. The pattern looked like carelessness until you climbed the watchtower and saw the geometry. The circles linked by narrow lanes that forced anything walking to show itself 3 times before it reached a door. Men do not like to be seen so often unless they are loved. The cold is many things. It is not love. John stood on the watchtower long after the work was done. He watched the pattern hold steady as if drawn in chalk on ice. He watched a child run from one circle to the next as if playing a game he had invented, yelling for a friend to follow and pointing, as children do, to teach what they have just discovered. He watched a brother pass a loaf over a low fence to a free folk woman and not meet her eyes, and watched the woman break the loaf and give the larger half back in a gesture older than all their songs. He watched Ghost lift his head and fix on a point in the trees, and he did not call out. He went down. What he found at the edge of the trees was not an army. It was quiet. It was a stillness so sharp it cut him even before anything moved. When he stepped forward, the snow under his boot did not crackle. It made a sound like held breath. At the 3rd step, he saw it, a figure that might once have been a man. Its face wrong because the parts had been arranged by a sculptor who did not understand skin. Its eyes were winter, given intent. It held a blade of pale in its hand that reflected not light, but the idea of it. "Back," he said to the men who had followed him without wanting to die and without knowing they had decided not to. His voice dropped in the air and did not bounce. There was no surface willing to throw it back to him. He did not draw Longclaw. He pulled a small cask from the sled they had dragged and set it down between him and the thing and stepped back. His hand found the tinder. The brand took slowly, sullen, as if it had been woken from a comfortable dream. He set the brand to the pitch line and watched it creep. An orange worm that forgot sometimes to be brave and then remembered. The thing twitched its head, considering. Then it stepped forward as a man does who has walked all his life and forgot for an instant that the earth turns. When the pitch found the place she had drawn in the yard, the line flared, not up but out. The flare made no sound. The cold recoiled. That did. It was not surprised. Surprise is human. It was insulted. It stepped back twice with the peculiar grace of a creature whose balance is in its contempt. "Not today," John said, because some words want saying even when no one hears them. Melisandre reached his shoulder without him noticing she had moved. She had a brand in her hand that burned a different color for a second, as flame sometimes does before it decides not to worry people. She did not lift it. She let it be seen. "It will not test this line again," she said. "It will send something else. Something with memory and without meaning. We will answer it with meaning and take its memory away." "What do you call that?" he asked, and he realized he meant not the thing that had turned away but the shape burned into the snow. "A lesson," she said. "The cold thinks it invented lessons because it lasts longer than we do. It forgets we invented teaching." Later that night, John went to the rookery with a thought clutched like a hot coal he meant to give away before it burned him. He found Samuel Tarley there, heavy with the sort of learning that sticks to a man even when he tries to shake it off. Sam had come to the wall a coward and discovered that fear is a compass whose needle points to what you cannot afford not to do. He stroked a raven with a tenderness that would have seemed ridiculous in any other place and was practical here. Ravens prefer gentleness. "Sam," John said, and the other man's face opened with the relief of seeing a familiar shore. "You're still alive," Sam said. "I mean, yes, of course. It's just a raven from Eastwatch brought a story, and everyone's stories are shorter than they ought to be, and I was worried. And now, do I deserve someone who worries?" John asked, half mocking, and Sam nodded with that grave earnestness men keep for their friends. "Everyone deserves someone who worries," he said, "just as everyone deserves a fire." John told him about the lines. Sam nodded and made small noises of approval that were as satisfying as a smith's grunt when a blade rings true. "Dragonglass," Sam repeated when John finished. "There's more at Dragonstone. There's more under it, if the old tales are not lies. Stannis might." He trailed off because politics made him tongue-tied. "Davos thinks Manderley will trade for fish and stone and songs if asked properly," John said. "Perhaps we will ask. Perhaps we will send a ship if the river does not swallow it. Perhaps the river will swallow it, and the ship will become a story. and stories are a different kind of fairy. Mammal. Sam smiled. You sound like old Nan. I have been counting circles, John said. Old Nan would have counted circles. Then she would have made a soup that tasted like rope and told us it would keep the cold from our bones, and somehow it would have. Sam's face softened at the name, the way men's do when a childhood word's weight returns unexpectedly and proves itself still solid. He let the raven hop to his other wrist. We will need maesters, he said, practical again. Aemon cannot be everywhere. I can teach a few to bind wounds and count pulse. I can make a book if Donal Noy gives me leather, and if anyone remembers how to boil vellum. The free folk have women who can set bones by feel, John. They learned because no one else would come. We'll put them and ours in a room together with a pot, and they'll argue, and then they'll learn each other's bad words first and medicine next. If they learn each other's bad words, John said, they'll be halfway to not fighting for the wrong reasons. They set it in motion. Ahai was given over to teaching the sorts of things men die of when pride says they should not. The cleaning of knives, the boiling of water, the herbs that tasted like earth and prevented the bowels turning traitor. A thin woman with a jaw that could gnaw through stubbornness was set beside a brother whose hands were surprisingly delicate. They taught each other by failing in front of one another and not dying of embarrassment. The hall stank of vinegar and hope. Men avoided it until they had to go in, and then came out looking dazed, as if someone had told them a plausible lie and then given them proof. Ghost ranged farther these days and came back later. His coat rimed with ice where breath had settled and frozen. Once he returned with something in his mouth that was not meat. He laid it at John's feet with a particular disdain of a cat who insists it is still a wolf, and sat back to watch. It was a fragment of horn, not new. The edges were burnished where many fingers had considered it. There were carvings along it that had been rubbed almost smooth by use or time. Circles and lines and something that might have been a wave or a flame depending on whether the eye wanted water or fire. Mance's foolish horn, Tormund said when John showed him. A pretty thing to blow and feel big blowing it. Won't wake any stone. Might wake a woman if you blow it right. Now, John ran his thumb along the carving. Even if it is nothing, it is a symbol, he said. Sometimes symbols are more dangerous than a weapon that works, because they are used by more men. We break it? Tormund asked. Or keep it? We keep it and refuse to worship it, John said. We let it remind us that noise is not always power. Melisandre took the horn and held it near a circle. The fire did not lean or recoil. It kept its counsel. There are older horns, she said. There are older songs. This is a child's toy a very old man carries because he likes to remember being small. Bender rewind. You speak like you don't remember, Tormund said, but without malice. I remember being small. She said, I do not remember liking it. Word came by a rider who did not dismount that a band had been seen with blue eyes moving along the coast beyond Eastwatch, and a ship had foundered in a bay that had no business catching ships, and the dead had learned to float. A man cannot get used to that. Castle Black became quieter in the way of places that have decided learning is not an embarrassment, but a necessity. Yor listened to two men tell him the same story 3 times, and then told them to tell it to 3 other men. He sent a message to Cotter Pike that was nothing like an order, and everything like a prayer disguised as a curse. If they take the sea, Jor said, we will have to learn new letters for our maps. We will have to write fewer letters and do more, John said, and the Lord Commander's mustache twitched with approval. He did not say aloud. They began to practice at night what they would need in the worst mornings. Lines of men moved from circle to circle, with brands held low and shields held higher. They passed children from one set of arms to another, practicing until the little ones laughed because being held is a game if done often enough. They timed themselves running between lights and learned how wind snuffs a flame and what to do when it does. How to shield it with the body without letting the cold cut your ribs with the long knife of breathlessness. They learned to shout and have the shout carry instead of splatter against the night and fall back in their faces. They learned to listen. You train men like hounds, a queen's man observed Melisandre. Not kindly. I train men like men," she said. "Hounds have the decency to admit they love the one who feeds them. Men prefer to call it duty. You blaspheme that word too easily. I use it as it was meant," she said. "As a thing one does because not doing it would make one smaller." He snorted. His breath steamed and vanished. She watched how it vanished, thinking of the other vanishings to come. One evening, the sky went the color of a bruise turning old, and the wind fell away as if scolded. Melisandre took that as an invitation. She asked for a bowl and a cup of wine and a pinch of salt. She walked to the weirwood grove without letting her feet remember how to be afraid. John followed because leading sometimes means making sure you know what your priest is doing with your gods. She set the bowl at the foot of the heart tree and poured the wine. It steamed where it hit, and the steam smelled faintly of summer, which was cruel and kind in the same mouthful. She pressed the salt between her fingers and let it fall in. Salt to recall the sea, which remembers everything. Then she pricked her thumb with a little knife and let blood fall, not as an offering to be accepted, but as a fact to be recorded. "Do you think the old gods care for your prayers?" John asked. "I think they care for their own," she said. "I am telling them we are ours. That is blasphemy against your own God. My God prefers fire." Fire prefers honesty to flattery. I will tell the fire what I did here. It will not punish me for speaking to what watches next to it. Pride is a colder vice than men think. It belongs to the dark. He looked at the pale face and saw nothing and felt something. His father had believed in gods who did not learn new songs. John had learned to love a God that burned, even if he did not pray to it. He could hold both thoughts without choosing, for now. That felt like a sin and a strength. "Azor Ahai," Melisandre said softly, not to John but to the bowl, as if one could speak to a sound and ask it to carry. "Lightbringer," she added, and she did not look at his sword. She looked at his hands, which had learned in the last weeks to do two things at once without shaking. The bowl cooled. The steam went away. The tree did not move, being a tree. The night deepened as if it had been thinking how to do so, and had finally remembered the cleverest way. Wintered birds came and went, unbothered by prophets. A boy cried in the yard and was scolded gently into sleep. A man coughed the cough of someone who has replaced food with work and needed to be reminded of the order of things. The circles burned. The lines did not go out. On the 8th day after Stannis set south, a knot of free folk arrived from Hardhome, voices like knives dragged against stone. They led children whose eyes were valleys, and carried the memory of a smell that made men wash their hands until the skin went raw. The story they brought was old and new. A winter town by the sea where the fish dried into leather worth chewing when you could not get bread. A sudden night that had nothing to do with the sky. A sense of being watched by something that did not blink or sleep. They spoke of a sound that was not a sound. The feeling of a footstep taken by the world and not by anything that had feet. They spoke of a woman who sang to keep the courage of the small from running out of their bodies, and the song breaking like glass. "We set boats," a man named Morna said, his mouth cracked with salt and grief. "We put little ones in first, and then the mothers, and then men jumped until the boats sat wrong in the water, and we told ourselves the sea would be kinder because it had old habits. Then the water between us and the land went still like a floor, and things began to walk on it as if they had suddenly remembered it could be walked on." In the hall, men did not breathe until he stopped speaking, and then they had to breathe all at once and cough. Sam wrote, his quill a small defiance. Aemon nodded the slow nod of an old man who had outlived his horror not because he had forgotten it, but because he had learned to speak to it as to a neighbor he disliked and played chess with anyway. "We will need ships," John said, after the telling had made its rounds and left silence behind. "We will need to go by water whether we like the taste of it or not. I will write to Eastwatch. I will write to White Harbor. I will ask for the sort of help men think they cannot afford to give until they realize they cannot afford not to." And And the men who went won't come back if we're too late, Morna said. He was not accusing. He was editing the shape of the truth. They may, Melisandre said. Her voice was oddly gentle. But not as you prefer. We will light the sea, as we have lit the yard. We will put circles on the waves. We will teach the water to remember heat. The cold has learned too much without being taught. It is time it had lessons. Nansawa. How do you teach water? Tormund asked, half mocking and half in love with the audacity of the question. You do not, she said. You teach men to float fire. They could not practice that yet. River ice made a liar of boats. But men took the idea into themselves and turned it over as if it were a coin they meant to spend in spring, and that mattered. Ideas, like sparks, need to be caught. When the letter went to White Harbor, it carried with it not only a request for ships and tar and patience, but a plan drawn in a hand that did not often draw. A line of small craft spread like beads along a rope, each with a brazier shielded and fed, each close enough that if one went out the others could reach to relight it. A way of ferrying children first and the old second, and those who could fight last, not because they mattered less, but because they could hold lines while the others learned to stand in a boat without making the water offended. It carried with it a promise. The wall would take those who came, by the 100, by the 1,000, and the gift would be parceled as a priest parcels bread, stringently and with an eye to who would die fastest without it. Lord Wyman wrote back in a hand that sprawled as if it had been fed well all its life. He agreed with the kind pragmatism of a banker. He offered 20 boats, perhaps 30 if he could bully 3 stubborn cousins into seeing their interest. He offered to send a man who knew how to persuade fishermen to trust a plan that did not begin with a net. He asked, not demanded, that the king be told he was doing this thing. He signed with a flourish that looked like a fish making a last jump. Davos read the letter aloud and nodded. He wants to do right. He also wants to be seen doing it and to be asked nicely by a king who will thank him. None of this disqualifies him from being useful. I will tell Stannis, Jon said. I will ask him to say please without saying please. He knows how, Davos said. He can make duty sound like grace, when he remembers that the one is how you summon the other. As snow continued to explain itself to the ground, the circles and lines became the new furniture of Castle Black's life. Men reached for brands before they reached for blame. Women began to thread cords through the sleeves of children's cloaks as if sewing a spell. Brothers and free folk together built a fence around the kitchen garden not to keep anyone out, but to remind all that a line existed, and the act of stepping over it changed you into a guest. It worked. Men like to be reminded when they are being watched. It makes their better habits stand taller. Jor began to tire in the afternoons. He did not say so. He sat without pretending the bench was a throne and told stories of winter nights, when the mutton stew had more water than meat, and the men had grumbled enough to warm the hall. He looked at Jon the way old men do when they decide they can hand a weight over without the world dropping it. I will not be here when the ships come, Jor said one evening, and Jon did not argue. He listened with his chin down as if to keep the words from blowing away. You will be. You will see things I never did. You will hate that, and then you will be glad, because the world that requires you to be the man you are is the only world that can be saved by that exact shape. I am not made for shrines, Jon said. It surprised him that this was the sentence his mouth chose, but once said, it felt right. Good, Jor said. Neither is the wall. It eats prayers and shits out chores. The gods like that kind of digestion. It keeps them honest. They sat in silence for a while, the only noise the scandalized chirp of a bird that had decided to winter because lazy. It hopped close to the circle and basked as if religion were a physical comfort, which perhaps it is. Ghost knows before you do, Jor said at last. Trust that. Trust Aemon's hands. Trust your red woman to tell you when her god's voice is her own and when it is borrowed. Intel, do you trust her? I trust that she will stand between me and a thing that cannot be made to bleed, and that is enough to make an ally, Jor said. Trust is not friendship. And yet I suspect she loves more than she admits, poor creature. That is why she frightens men. Fire is always love's metaphor, because it does not pretend neutrality. It decides and then it consumes. Melisandre watched Azor the next day, with a considering sadness. In the flame she had seen a raven perched on a bare branch, and then the branch had been empty, and the raven had been elsewhere, carrying a letter no man could read. She did not tell anyone. She closed her hand around the vision and warmed it, and kept her mouth shut. A rider came with news of Bolton banners sighted above a keep that had not asked to be flown over. Men swore and wished for summer anger. Stannis would answer that with iron. Jon did not need to. He needed to count boats and sacks and brandlings and the number of children whose boots would need new soles before spring. He needed to teach men to tie knots that would hold in water. He needed to turn the free folk from a movement into neighbors. He went to manse again with Tormund and Val and a pot of stew that would have embarrassed a court and pleased a camp. What? They sat under a sky learning how to be kind. They talked of hostages, wards, and chose 3 more boys and a girl and a man to keep their pride in check. They agreed on punishments for theft that took a day's labor and not a hand. They told 3 lies apiece as jokes to test whether anyone would laugh. They did. Your red woman looks at me as if I am a hearth under which she is considering building a house, Mance said mildly, sipping. Tell her I do not mind. Priests have to put their god somewhere. The rest of us do too. She will not burn your tree, Jon said. I know, Mance said. She told me. She tells me things I don't like to hear. That makes her useful. Val watched the exchange with her cool eyes and weighed something. Finally she said, if we come through your gate and you break your word, I will not bother to kill you. I will take your hand. The one you use least. The one you use most, I will leave so you can learn to live with the loss of the other. And so? Jon inclined his head. You will not need to take either. You sound sure, she said. I like sure men. I also like ones who admit when they are going to be wrong and tell me before they are. That way I can prepare. I will tell you, he said. Even if it makes you leave. It will, she said. Sometimes. When they returned, the gate's creak sounded less like complaint, and more like a big dog too content to bother barking. The circles burned. The lines held. The sky promised snow, and kept it. Melisandre warmed her hands at the shrine the Queen's men had raised and stared into its little confidence. She saw then something she had been trying not to. A boy on the ground, bleeding into snow that tried to refuse the color and fail. Men gathered around the boy, knives out, their mouths full of what they called oath and duty and blood. She saw a wolf run and a hand that had become a fist without meaning to. She saw a door opening not from man's hand, but because the cold decided to step through. She shut her eyes and opened them, and the flame was only flame again. No prophecy is a promise. It is a map, thought A2. Maps are useful until the river changes its mind. She went from circle to circle, checking wicks, adding fat, teaching a boy to whisper to a flame without feeling foolish. She told herself a story a woman had once told a girl to keep her from shivering. About a time when summer had been so long, men had complained of it, and then winter had come as if insulted and taken offense at their boredom and stayed. The story ended with a fire and bread, as all stories should. Azor Ahai, she whispered once more. Not as a title, but as a friend's name said across a room to comfort both speaker and spoken. The fire lifted and settled, as if to say I hear you, and then got back to its work. So did she. So did they all.